said that our thoughts that morning had to be with the people who've lost their lives due to COVID and the many, many bereaved loved ones, friends and communities coping with their sudden loss. And tragically, 1 year later, I'm going to have to repeat this beginning. But the number I quote in this regard is no longer the 1,600 that I quoted this time last year, but it's actually almost 5,000. I'm sure there can't be many listening to me live or on a recording afterwards who've not been personally affected by one or more of these losses. And I'd like to acknowledge, therefore, the personal tragedy that has unfolded for people behind each one of those almost 5,000 situations. And since this time last year, we have witnessed what in reality is the greatest upheaval in recent history, setting in motion waves of change that have the potential to transform our society and economy. The trajectory of some of these changes is already becoming clear. Remote working, a renewed interest in decentralization, increased collaboration between the state and civil society, new approaches to addressing our people's health and social needs, a renewed interest in social enterprise, more progressive fiscal policy. These are just some of the trends that have either emerged or accelerated during the pandemic, and we'll be talking about all of those today and tomorrow. Above all, however, considering the gathering of us here today, we've been reminded of the significance of community. Over the past year, we've taken part in and watched, read and listened to stories of communities coming together, and we all marveled at what could happen when care, compassion, and social solidarity takes priority. And it's important to acknowledge the development of greatly enhanced connection and collaboration between the broad community voluntary sector and the state during the period of the pandemic. And this continues to progress at pace in the time, definitely since our last summit. I can list many specific examples of this. For example, the rollout of the Stability Fund for charities, additional cash allocations in the last budget for the sector, flexible contract arrangements between the sector and state agencies in battling COVID, and the broad solidarity built through the community call. This in turn has enabled our sector's voice to be listened to more attentively on broader issues, as evidenced, for example, by the Wheel's participation in the Shared Island initiative, and just last week, actually, in a major future economic planning discussion organised by the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. I could continue to list more detail about that collaboration and new ways of relationship building, but the fact is that as a result of the necessity of COVID, what really happened is that the sum of cooperation did become greater than the parts. Our sector received a call to action, and we responded in flying colours. And the public, the state, and its many agencies and bodies both relied on our contribution and came to acknowledge its vital and central role. Now that the threat from COVID is hopefully at last receding, we're all tempted to seek some sort of return to normal, I guess, or whatever version of that means, as soon as possible. But let's recall, of course, that the old normal wasn't that great in so many ways for so many of us. And I guess for us in the community and voluntary sector organisations, the challenge must be to retain the learnings, flexibility and cooperation that COVID required of all of us. And we must continue with the courage, the determination and the collaboration to take all of this to the next level. And we must make sure that the state agencies that the sector worked so constructively with aim to make this new, much more productive way of working the new normal in the period ahead. New challenges and opportunities for the sector and the state alike will be presented by the rollout of the 3 new government strategies for the sector, all originating from the Department of Rural and Community Development. They being the 5-year strategy for the community and voluntary sector, the social enterprise policy, and the national volunteering strategy. Additionally, new challenges and opportunities can also be presented by the current work of the Health Dialogue Forum, established on foot of the report of the Independent Review Group on Health and Social Services. And indeed, by developing issues like the role of community endeavour in tackling the threat of climate change. We in the Wheel And we are all here today are certainly determined to play our part in the fullest. And it's precisely these challenges and opportunities that are going to be the subject of our discussion over the next 2 days. Our summit this year is very much concerned with looking forward. COVID-19 has tested our resilience and taught us much about ourselves as people, communities, and organizations. Today's plenary session will be looking at what we've learned about ourselves as a society and as economy, as people. So it's outward focus. Tomorrow, the focus will turn inwards to the sector itself in terms of what we've learned about the way we do our work and how that's been impacted positively and negatively by the crisis, and what the best way forward for the sector and its vital work looks like. And I guess this is a time for all of us to be brave and creative, to forge a vision of a better society, a fair and just society, a compassionate and resilient society, prepared for whatever the future may hold. We can deliver on such a vision if we nurture and support and champion our community and voluntary sector. The future is ours to make. I'd sincerely like to thank our speakers in advance, our panel chairs, the nearly 2,000 members of the Wheel itself, our partners, our funders, our staff, and indeed each of you who will be taking part over the next 2 days. I'd also like to thank our board of directors and the additional 13 people who serve along with board members as volunteers on our board subcommittees. And I think that's really important to say that in this National Volunteering Week in Ireland. They work very hard on our members' behalf to progress our organisation's vision of a thriving community and voluntary sector, charity and social enterprise sector at the heart of a fair and just and inclusive Ireland. And lastly, before I hand over to the first session, before I hand over to the next part of the morning, I'd really like, and on a personal level and sincerely, thank Paul O'Sullivan, who you will hear from tomorrow morning as he addresses his final summit as chair of the Wheel. It has been my privilege and my pleasure, and I've learned so much from Paul, and I've really enjoyed working with him as a board member and as chair. And I've just wanted to say that in front of our members here today. Throughout the next 2 days, please share your ideas and views, share your questions, thoughts and inputs using the question and answer session by using the Q&A function, or on social media using the hashtag Charity Summit. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce on Taoiseach Micheál Martin TD, who will deliver a special message to our summit before we get going. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation to speak to you all today. It gives me great pleasure to recognise the work of the community and voluntary sector, albeit virtually. I've had close engagement with the sector over many years, and I wish to congratulate you all on the resilience you have all shown in adapting to the challenges of the last year. I'm conscious that there are charities, social enterprises, and community and voluntary organisations from every corner of the country joining us today. So I would like to take this opportunity to sincerely thank you for the efforts you make and for your dedication and hard work throughout the COVID-19 pandemic in particular. You reach out into every community in our country, and you make it a more inclusive, fairer and kinder place to live in. Without a thriving partnership model and the essential work being done by groups like yours on the ground, we simply could not reach all the people we need to. The community and voluntary sector has always been crucial to the provision of critical services for the most marginalised in Irish society, and never more so than the last year. The diversity of work undertaken by the sector and the contribution to society as a result is huge. Whether that is through delivering Meals on Wheels, illness supports, befriending, environmental work, combating poverty, addiction, tackling homelessness, building communities, or supporting mental health. You have responded to the challenges of the pandemic with willingness and flexibility, and despite the difficulties faced, you were a key part of our great national effort. Through collaboration, local actions and national initiatives, government and the sector have worked well together in a comprehensive and coordinated way on a truly unprecedented scale. We recognise that recent months have not been easy for already stretched organisations. Social restrictions have impacted fundraising and trading income, and there has been an increased demand on services. For that reason, government set aside additional funding through various initiatives, including the €45 million COVID-19 Stability Fund, the €5 million Innovate Together Fund, the VAT Compensation Scheme, and the Community Services Programme Support Fund. I was pleased that government could provide an allocation of €10 million for the COVID-19 Stability Fund in 2021 as part of the revised Resilience and Recovery Plan. Officials in the Department of Rural and Community Development and PUBL will be accepting applications for funding over the coming days. We are fully committed to supporting and empowering you. Regular engagement will only strengthen and reinforce this partnership. We have introduced a suite of policy initiatives and are in the process of implementing them. The Sustainable, Inclusive and Empowered Community Strategy sets out a vision for how we will work together in the future. Through the National Social Enterprise Policy for Ireland, the Government aims to create an environment for social enterprise to grow and contribute to Ireland's social and economic progress. Its implementation will give new opportunities to address social and environmental challenges, contribute to revitalising local communities, and support many of those most vulnerable in society. The first National Volunteering Strategy was also published this year. It aims to recognise, promote and grow the unique value and contribution volunteers make to Irish society. Volunteering involves a generosity of spirit and kindness combined with a decision to act. These attributes and values can bring profound positive change to people's lives, communities, our country and the planet. While progress on the implementation of these policies has been delayed due to the impact of the pandemic, we are fully committed to realising their objectives and building a brighter future together. We know that the challenges are not yet fully behind us, but we also know that the generosity of spirit, the willingness, resilience and partnership that has brought us this far will get us to the other side of this pandemic. We will continue to listen and to work together to achieve a more inclusive and empowered society. Finally, on behalf of myself as Taoiseach, all of government and all who value the massive contribution you are making every day, thank you. Your efforts are truly valued and appreciated. Go raibh míle maith agaibh go léir, agus go nairóig an tálamh.
Many thanks to Taoiseach Micheál Martin. It's always really most welcome to hear such acknowledgement and thanks, isn't it, for the hard work and dedication of the charity, community and voluntary and social enterprise sector, both throughout the COVID pandemic, but also beyond. As the Taoiseach rightly said, I guess without the combination of the coordinated partnership model with government and the community and voluntary network, which runs often unseen throughout the entire country, we simply can't reach all those who need it. I welcome the Taoiseach's firm commitment to supporting our sector through the 3 strategies I mentioned earlier, and he clearly places great importance on their implementation, which is very welcome. Additionally, his commitment to regular engagement with the sector so that we can build that more inclusive and empowered society, which he speaks of together. And lastly, I particularly welcome the Taoiseach's desire for a thriving partnership model. So we, in the Wheel, are very much looking forward to engaging with him and his cabinet colleagues in government, and indeed the community and voluntary pillar, on new approaches to deepening social dialogue as per the commitment in the programme for government. That's really important for creating and building the future together. And we in the Wheel will be continuing to engage with all government departments on these and other sector development matters over the course of this year as we represent our members and champion the broader sector. So, I'd now like to introduce our first plenary session of Summit 2021. This session is entitled Envisioning the Post-COVID-19 World, Building Back Best. And it's interesting, I've heard a variety of different coinages in relation to that phrase, the United Nations building forward better, as distinct from building back better. And this is the one that we've gone for in terms of building back, but best, right? And this is going to be chaired by Peter McBride, Director at the Cone Centre for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And Peter will introduce the rest of the panel, or the panel. Peter has spent his career working in the voluntary sector in Northern Ireland, though with a significant international profile. He's recognised as an expert in post-conflict mental health and trauma. Until 2019, he worked in the mental health services, latterly as chief executive of the charity Inspire Wellbeing. And he's been chair and trustee of many large charities in the UK and Ireland. So over to you, Peter, as they say, the stage is yours, and I will exit stage left. Thank you very much.
Deirdre, thank you. Thank you so much for that very warm welcome. One of my great privileges in my career was to be a trustee of the Wheel for a period of time. And I have to say, it was a great pleasure and privilege to work with colleagues on the Wheel, and therefore a great pleasure and privilege to be invited to chair this session this morning. It is a reflection of the of the wonder of Zoom that I'm speaking to you from in my role as director of the Cone Centre for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which is based in Keene, New Hampshire. So I'm sitting in the United States speaking to you and reflecting with you on these global challenges, the global changes that we face in seeking to work in the community sector and make the differences that we aspire to make. And so this morning's session is very much an outward-facing session. It's thinking about what's going on in the world, thinking about the massive changes that are happening economically and at a community level. Understanding, as Deirdre and Antisha both identified, huge opportunities, I think, that exist as a consequence of us surviving, of us coming through the COVID-19 challenge, but also, and I think this is incredibly important, being able to acknowledge the terrible price that has been paid, both in terms of those people that we have lost in our communities, but also the psychological impact of living in lockdown for the last year, over the last year. So I think this morning is both going to be about that sort of global focus and thinking about these macro issues, as well as thinking about the price that we paid and the impact that that has. The fact that we are able to have a conference where 1,000 people are able to get together on Zoom would have been unheard of a year ago or 6 or 18 months ago. And yet this is going to be the new norm. We know that in the future, communication is going to be different, that how we relate to one another is going to be different. Sometimes that's going to be enhanced. Sometimes I think we're going to feel the loss. Before we started this morning, we were reflecting, myself and the other panel members, at this stage in a normal, inverted commas, conference, we would be having coffee before the presentation, feeling a bit anxious, talking to one another before the conference started. As it is, we're all sitting in our own homes in front of our computers, maybe with our coffees, equally feeling anxious, but without the possibility of a hug or handshake or a pat on the back. So things are different now. And we have the opportunity to engage with that and to explore what the future holds for us. We have a fantastic panel this morning. I can't tell you how excited I am to hear our speakers. We have Dr. Shana Cohen, Stephanie Regan, Adele McGinley, and Seamus Boland. And the format is going to be we're going to start off in quite a structured way. Each of the speakers is going to have 7 minutes in which to do a brief presentation to us. I've warned them all that I'm going to be really strict about this, so I have my phone in front of me here. I'm going to start the timer, and at 7 minutes or 6 minutes, I'll put a hand up to give notice, and then at 7 minutes, I may well find myself speaking over people. But and the reason I want to be quite disciplined about that is I want to give you the chance to engage with us in conversation when the speakers are finished. So we have 4 speakers. We'll let each of them have their 7 minutes. And then we'll have an open plenary session in which there will be an open discussion among the speakers, but that will be informed by questions that you put forward. So if you look at the bottom right-hand part of your screen, you'll see the Q&A section on the bottom panel. Please be putting questions into that for us. we will try to reflect all of the questions that you have. We might aggregate some of them together into themes. Also, do this as the speakers are speaking. So, for example, we are going to be starting with Dr. Shana Cohen. So, by the time we finish, the last speaker will be Seamus Boland. We want to make sure that we have questions for Shana lined up. So do please, as soon as you feel a question coming on, pop it into the Q&A section, and we will aggregate those questions together. So we're going to make a start. We're going to start. Our first speaker is Dr. Shana Cohen. Dr. Cohen is the director of TASC. She studied at Princeton University and at the University of California, Berkeley, where she received a PhD in sociology. Her PhD analysed the political and social consequences of market reform policies in Morocco for young, educated men and women. Since then, she has continued to conduct research on how economic policies have influenced political and social identity, particularly in relation to collective action and social activism. She has taught at George Washington University, University of Sheffield, and the University of Cambridge. So we are really excited and delighted to have Dr. Cohen with us this morning. And without further ado, I hand over to her. Thank you, Shana.
Thank you. And thank you, Deirdre, and thank you to the Wheel for inviting me. I think I've done this once or twice before. I feel really privileged to be able to speak, especially in these circumstances. And I appreciate the background. I have lived in a number of countries, and I've worked with civil society organizations in very different contexts, in democracies like Ireland and in the US and in the UK, as well as places like Egypt and Morocco, where there are fewer freedoms and NGOs are under increasing political pressure. So today I just want to speak very broadly, in part with the time limit in mind. I think there's an obvious lesson, and it was encouraging to hear the Taoiseach speak about this. There's an obvious lesson from the pandemic for the sector here in Ireland and anywhere, is that civil society organizations require funding, and they require core funding. They shouldn't have to devote a huge amount of their resources to chasing funds, because that detracts from delivering services. And the funding needs to be multi-year, so there's some security. It's impossible to hire a quality staff if you're constantly looking for funding. So I think that that's the most obvious lesson, but I was going to focus on 3 lessons very briefly that I think are less obvious, but perhaps equally important. The first is that, as Deirdre noted, the sector needs to continue to push the argument that the sector has valuable knowledge about the complexity of social issues, particularly coming out of the pandemic. So the sector CSOs need to be able to provide input to policymakers, and they need to be regarded as valuable partners. There's an argument for the role of civil society in addressing social problems versus the state, although public services are certainly core in order to address particularly health and education, but also the private sector, because there is competition with private sector companies to deliver services, and CSOs can often address those problems in a localized fashion or in a national fashion that's more effective. So there needs to be a discussion with the state, not just about the complexity of social issues and the comfort that CSOs have in understanding them, but also about procurement and impact assessment, which I'll get to again in just a second. The second lesson is the value of expanding the role and engagement of CSOs with social groups beyond sort of what's considered to be socially marginalized, socially excluded groups. Civil society organizations rely upon a volunteer force that the Taoiseach noted, but also a workforce. And the scale of the social problems we will be facing coming out of the pandemic means I think civil society organizations have a case for saying that their work can actually help a wider group of the section of the population than has typically been thought of the case. You think of charity, you think of people who are living in poverty, but actually a wide section of the population, particularly younger generations, need support. And there's a role for CSOs, not just here, but in other countries. And the third is that Ireland is a vibrant democracy. It's an open global economy, but it's one of the very few in the world that operates that way. So because we are working in such even though you may not feel that way sometimes, because CSOs are working in an open democratic system, they have something to offer CSOs in other countries, such as a country I've been familiar with, Morocco, where NGOs are facing, as I said, a lot of constraints on both funding and political pressure. And just to detail the problems really quickly, as I said, an increasing portion of the population is facing multiple challenges related to income, the lack of available public services. A very hot topic right now is housing and the job market. So I think that CSOs are placed in a very good position to recognize the complexity and the localization of social problems and to develop the trust that's required to help people at a local level, more so than I would argue private contractors. And I think a key factor in this is making a case to the government for better evaluation of the impact of CSOs, not just here, but elsewhere, to coordinate with civil society organizations in other countries. And it has to be beyond outputs and outcomes or even prescribed impact, which relates to targets and funding again, to how CSOs enable civic and political engagement, how they help people with preventative behavior related to health, and importantly, how they are successful or effective in addressing multiple issues like health, education, mental health issues simultaneously. The second is that there's the scale of job losses, as I mentioned, especially among younger generations, and the mental health issues that these generations, not just these generations, also older people are facing, means that there's an argument for saying that the sector has a role in helping a wide section of the population. If you looked at the recent ESRI report, it said that employment among young people, so 15 to 24, has fallen between 60 and 50% from last year, a year ago. And this is compared to 25% for those aged 25 to 29 and 55 plus and 20% for other age groups. So that's unemployment across the board, but especially for younger people and even up to the age of 29 and over 55. At the same time, if you look at a recent Eurofund report on the impact of COVID-19, you find the same generations are suffering from depression, anxiety, loneliness, especially young people and women over 50. So there's a role for civil society organizations in helping those people come out of a period which has been fairly dark for some of them. I can speak to research Task is doing just in terms of young people reporting higher use of drugs, higher abuse of alcohol, depression, gaining weight. So it's not, CSOs are not just helping the most vulnerable groups, they have a role in helping particularly younger generations, single parents, also older people, migrants. So and that's not just through immediate help, but also a network of social activities, health campaigns, training, preparation for the job market. And there's an argument to be made, going back to this funding sustainability, that the sector offers young people and older people an avenue for employment, but it has to be decent jobs so they can see a potential for a future, not just a one-year contract, but a lifetime career. So the last thing very quickly I was going to just end on. Ireland, if you look at the Civicus Monitor for 2020, it's 2019, but it's the Civicus annual report. Civicus is an international organization that looks at civil society. The Ireland is green, which means it's very open, but our neighbor, UK, is a pale green, and so is France, and so is Spain. The pandemic has illustrated the potential, not just of state intervention to help the population, but also state intervention to limit freedoms. Because we are in a position to take advantage of those freedoms, we should help just even our next door neighbor in helping CSOs understand their impact, but also advocate for their role better and to advocate for them, to advocate for civil society elsewhere, which is under threat. And I can just end with another statistic from that Eurofund report. The only states they found that gained trust during the pandemic were Denmark and Finland, and those are states with strong welfare systems. The rest of the countries in the EU have suffered a loss of trust, and the EU itself has suffered a loss of trust amongst EU citizens during the pandemic. Now, if we look at other historical contexts or we look at other countries now, the loss of trust can lead to authoritarianism or greater embrace of authoritarian measures. We are in a position to fight that, and we should fight that. So not just looking inwardly, we should also look outwardly. How can we as a sector help civil society in other countries which are facing encroachment upon freedoms? And I would say that, again, going back to this, the data we collect on ourselves, the capacity to advocate, make changes in policy, and the effectiveness of dealing with complex social problems is a way for us to help other is to help civil society organizations in other countries. Anyway, I will stop it there, and thank you again for the invitation.
Anna, thank you so much. I found that really inspiring, actually, and the prospect of, or thinking about not just how we might want to think about how we develop here in Ireland, but also thinking about how we might be a resource for other countries, I think is incredibly exciting, actually, and puts what we're thinking about in a very different context. If I could remind you to any questions for Shana, please put in the Q&A, and we will keep a note of those and come back to those when all of the speakers have finished speaking. So I'm delighted now to introduce Stephanie Regan. Stephanie is a clinical psychotherapist with over 30 years experience. She will be familiar to some of you because she's a frequent contributor in the media, in print, and on our airwaves. Her areas of special expertise and interest are in the areas of workplace well-being, trauma, and relationships. So I'm really delighted to introduce to you Stephanie Regan. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Deirdre, and all of you there at the wheel. It's so nice for me to be invited to talk to you. I have never been introduced here before, so I take it as quite a special thing to do today, and especially at this extraordinary time and the year that we have had. So you've asked me to speak because largely I'm involved in the mental health care side of things, and I am really struck first and want to just put forward that personal perspective that people have when you are a therapist. I suppose we look at the underside of things. We are always listening to what is happening for people and at an emotional and psychological level. And in some ways we have a glimpse, almost like a peep in the door to what is happening in the world in general. And we have really, I think we were very early in pointing out this increase in demand for support, this anxiety, we could feel it. And now we are in many ways able to impart it a little bit. So I would just say, first off, as in life itself, the journey through this year has been very individual. I suppose just like life itself, that's how it goes. We start in a different place and we come with a different set of circumstances. And then we meet the event that is before us from that position. And as Deirdre mentioned earlier, 5,000 people have been bereaved. This is an extraordinary impact on families. So whether you were touched by death, whether you were touched by grief, whether you were on the front line working through the anxiety of keeping going when everyone didn't know where this horrible illness was going and how it was affecting people and who could transfer it and who could not. This was a very tense time for those people. Whether you were a healthcare worker looking into the eyes of patients and trying not to, but inevitably absorbing the trauma and fear that they were carrying. After SARS, we learned that healthcare workers, 1 year afterwards, as many as 43% of them have been showing various signs of depression and anxiety. And we would relate these very definitely and directly to their experience on the front line as healthcare workers. The other key thing, and I suppose because you are in the charity sector, it's very clear to me that so much was determined by socioeconomic factors. A job that could be done remotely meant a lot. It also kept us all busy, which was, I think, a privilege. But the simple things of, did you have a back garden or a room that you could step away from other people, that meant a lot. And of course, hugely, whether you had issues at home, whether you had already mental health issues there in your family, drug addiction, or all of these, a violent relationship, a difficult relationship, or simply a stressed marriage. These were all the issues that meant we really weren't all in the same boat. We were all in the same storm, but many of us had very different positions to start from. I couldn't help thinking of you as volunteers because so many here in front of me today are probably volunteers, and volunteering is so good for our own mental health, and it gives us a real sense of value and a real sense of being able to, I suppose, impact the environment that is around us and influence it. And I feel that has been probably very helpful to people. And of course, like myself, you also have to mind yourself within all of that. Which brings me to the whole thing of, I suppose, self-care, that we all learned so much in this. Self-care isn't an indulgence. We now know it's our responsibility. And I think at a mental health level, there's been an effort to get that message across for a long time. And here it is. It has been the lived experience of the last year for people. So everybody has been reminded about routine, about keeping balance, stepping back from work, stepping back and taking space, keeping fit, all of these things. So there's been a lot of progress on a mental health front in terms of awareness and understanding of the factors that keep us well. And I think that's really amazing. I suppose we have to acknowledge that every different cohorts had different impacts. We really knew, and it was very apparent to me quite early on the listening in Zoom, that young people were more stressed than others. And that has really shown up. You know that in our CAMHS situation now, we have 2,000 children and young people on waiting lists. The waiting lists were already there. Like in general, in our mental health service, there were already issues. A little like in our physical, if you like, medical system, we had the issue with ICU beds. Well, we have the same kind of issue in mental health care. We don't have the funds. We know that there's only 6% of a budget of our health budget goes to mental health services, you know, versus 12% in other countries like the UK and Germany. We really need a lot of funding in that regard. But that said, it's also how do we use that funding? So young people were definitely more stressed. The other area that we really found an impact was in the workplace. Very interesting just how much work became that social place. And it was only in its absence that people could feel fully what it meant to them. And I think our workplace, for so many people, we had to help managers to focus in on everyone's well-being, and they did it instantly and pretty immediately. And what we have learned and what they have learned has been an overnight awareness, if you like, campaign. They understand that people who are alone need more support. People need lots of encouragement, not always criticism and correction. They know that people need to step back from their work and not to be sending them lots of emails late at night, so that they can facilitate and insist that people disconnect and step back from their work and from their digital world, which we probably needed. We know it was a friend, but it can be it's an enemy if you don't know how to control it. We know we're going to be heading into a hybrid version of remote work, and this is going to thrust, I think, enormous new responsibilities on management, and I think in a very good way. We know that we already have lots and lots of EAP programs, but now they really know how to step that up and how to be proactive, not just reactive to health issues. If I can just say, in terms of overall, I think people have reevaluated their lives, what is important to them. Family have obviously come top of that list. And I think, will people be able to bring that forward? Will they be able to work out in the future? Do we want to go shopping all the time? Is it all about money? Is it all about the visual, the Instagram moment? Will there be an impact? I'm not sure yet. Will we revert to our patterns? We have to see. Something we have really learned also, I think, is how connected we are and how much we need that connection. And of course, how interconnected we are. And when I was thinking about this morning, I was thinking about all you volunteers and in your charity sector. And I thought the concept of the greater good has been very clear to you. I think because you are people who have stepped up to that and acted on it. But I think it's something that has changed in the world for everybody. It's been kind of that lived experience for people throughout this whole year. And I think it's going to really help people in the future to understand that reaching out, being connected, helping others, and how to help is really something we all have in our mitt, and it's something we can do easily. I think this can be a golden age for mental health care and well-being. And that's not to put it glibly or to put it in too shiny a context. This has been a very difficult year, and we have been able to support those who have needed that support. But we know that for years, there's so much that has to be done in our mental health care service. And we shouldn't have these backlogs. We shouldn't have these waiting lists. We don't need to have them. Zoom has certainly facilitated that. I think we can bring those back. But it's going to require will. It's going to require decisions by government to include greater levels of personnel that include people like counsellors and therapists, and not just to stay strictly down the medical line, because as they stay along the medical...
Draw to a close, please. Yeah.
Thank you. As we stick to the medical line, we become very, very limited in what we can achieve. Look what can be done when we apply ourselves to the common task for the common good. Thanks so much.
Stephanie, thank you so much. As you were speaking, I was thinking about the role the voluntary sector plays in society as a service provider, often of many mental health services, but also when you mention the workplace, the voluntary sector is also a significant employer. And yes. So it's one of the areas in which, as employers, we can think about how we support our own staff around this in terms of their mental well-being. So it's and we can live up to the aspirations that we set out there. So thank you very, very much. That was really interesting. Again, questions for Stephanie, please put in the Q&A. We're starting to gather up some questions. So we're really looking forward to the plenary session when we have finished. I'm now delighted to introduce Adele McGinley. Adele is the director of Migrant Rights Centre Ireland. She has worked with Migrant Rights Centre Ireland since 2006. In her time there, she has coordinated the Justice for the Undocumented campaign and held responsibility for MRCI's communications. She is the current chair of PICUM, which is the platform for the International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants, and a board member of Uplift, a multi-issue campaign organisation. Adele previously coordinated 2 Equality for Women initiatives, including developing the Domestic Workers Action Group and work with migrant women in rural Ireland. We are really delighted to have Adele join us this morning and to bring us this perspective around migrants in Ireland. So over to you, Adele.
Great, thank you, Peter. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here as well, delighted to be invited. So MRCI works at the intersection of the labour market and immigration, primarily with people at risk of poverty, exploitation, social exclusion, discrimination, and we work primarily with low-paid kind of precarious sectors of the labour market. And I suppose today I want to talk really about kind of 3 things: what we're seeing, the gains that have been made, and how we can hold on to those gains. I think that's really a very, very important thing when we think about building back better. So as most of you know, COVID for us, it has certainly amplified inequality, exposed those living on the edge and those who have limited access to security and social protection. Certain groups have been more disproportionately affected, so travellers, migrants, people seeking asylum, young people, older people, women. We've seen COVID has highlighted really the dependency on essential workers, who are mainly low-wage workers in precarious employment, and they've become very central to our survival. And I think that we begin to recognise that more and more. For migrant workers, the impact has been the lack of access to social protection, the treatment of undocumented workers, and migrant workers being overrepresented in some of those essential work areas. So in care, home care, agri-food, and workers in the gig economy. The period has also amplified and shown kind of long-standing issues in relation to health and safety practices in workplaces and poor terms and conditions, and kind of really amplify that lack of value on workers in certain sectors, particularly in home care and I guess across kind of meat factory workers. It's also exposed flaws in our institutions that have been set up really to protect workers and to protect our rights. So the Health and Safety Authority really not being able to kind of respond as quickly, and the Workplace Relations Authority not being able to respond as quickly. What we now see is the emergence of kind of a new worker divide, those who will be privileged to be able to work remotely and from home, and those who won't be. So our meat factory workers, our food pickers, our retail workers, those who work in care, and then obviously those who are unemployed and will begin to find it hard to readjust back into the labour market. But there have been important gains. It wasn't a business as usual approach during this period, and I think that was really important. We saw that wins and things could change quickly, and that the state could respond promptly, and the community sector responded extremely well. The community and voluntary sector, we all stepped up our game. We had to change, and we had to respond to the situation, and that was really important. The focus on essential work, as I was saying, has put that renewed focus on a living wage, and how we need to kind of legislate for that. That's now with the Low Pay Commission. It remains to be seen what will happen with that. We've seen a big focus on sick pay, and what that means, the lack of it. So health to the fore. There's legislation now promised to be introduced by the end of the year. Again, we'll have to see the devil in the detail in what's included in that sick pay legislation, and how workers are protected in that. For undocumented migrants, for example, we saw the introduction of a firewall where undocumented migrants could access services and social welfare, and that their data wouldn't be shared between departments and result in a deportation order. This needs to be retained. We, during this period, saw agreement to get a regularization scheme for undocumented migrants, one over 10 years, to be introduced in the autumn. Again, a huge achievement in a period of COVID, when things seemed to be going bad. There was some advances, and again, putting that spotlight on certain sectors of the economy where we need to focus our concentration now as we come out of the pandemic. In terms of holding on to the gains and building back best, I suppose, as we all know, technology has transformed the way we work. It's transformed our work in how we outreach to people, the connections we made, and how we hold on to this in a hybrid, introducing hybrid approaches in the delivery of our work. We know change is possible and can happen quickly. It's up to us, I think, to get on the offensive and to work for transformative change, not just for the delivery of services, but for policies and legislation that transform the way our lives and the lives of people are in Ireland and beyond. I do believe there's a greater need for solidarity across our sectors, sharing the gains and the new approaches, because what worked maybe in health and might work in another sector as well. So there's something about gathering that information together, and kind of analysing the wins and the gains and the approaches that have kind of been developed. We do have to be very careful, and there's a lot of questions in the chat here about funding and partnerships and different approaches. We need to be very careful about the frame that has always been there, that there's competition for scarce resources. We know there's money there. It's shown. It has been given to us. The Innovation Fund, the other funds. All money is based on political choices, and no change happens unless we demand it, and we demand that of our politicians. So it's really important that we demand more, and we need to watch now for recession narratives that will undermine the progress that has been made, the gains that have been made, and that's really important as we move out. We also need to put a focus on the connections between work, health, consumption, and the environment, which has been made visible through this period. We need to begin to engage with just transition frameworks, what that means for workers, what that means for society. We need to get ahead of that, and I think it's come to the fore very much in this period. We need autonomous, independent civil society that can hold power to account. And I suppose that is a big issue, that if we don't hold our politicians to account, demand the funding or the infrastructure that we need, that is our role as well. And we have to hold on of the right of people to move now and more than ever as the world changes into the future. So there's some of the thoughts and reflections around building back best, and I do welcome other questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adele. That's wonderful, and it is challenging to think about the people for whom the changes that many of us experience in terms of increased flexibility, being able to work from home using Zoom, for many workers, those are not a reality because of the nature of their work and the nature of their circumstances. So it is equally important to remember the particular challenges that they're going to face. So again, I would ask you questions for Adele, please pop them in the Q&A. Our final speaker is Seamus Boland. Seamus is Chief Executive Officer of Irish Rural Link and is President of Diversity Europe, which is part of the European Economic Social Council. He is formerly manager of Tullamore Traveller Workshop and Shannon Banks Workshop in Athlone. In 1995, he was appointed Regional Director of Midland Regional Youth Service. He became the National Coordinator in 2001. He is a member of the Carnegie Rural Commission, which examines rural issues in Great Britain and Ireland, and he has recently been appointed to the board of POBL. He serves on a number of national development plan monitoring committees and is a community and voluntary pillar representative on the National Economic and Social Council. He is a holder of a BSc in Rural and Community Development from NUI Maynooth. It is a great privilege for us to have Seamus with us this morning. I'll hand you over to him.
Good morning to you, Peter, and I hope everybody can see and hear me. So thank you very much for the honor of talking to you this morning. And I'm just going to watch my time as I start. I suppose before I even introduce Irish Rural Link and all of that, I just really am putting 4 questions to people as they think about post-COVID and as they think about it yourselves, because everything does go back to ourselves. What are we individually thinking? And I suppose the 4 questions I've heard asked, and it made me think, first of all, basically, how has it changed you? And the way to look at that is, what habits have we now formed? It's an interesting question. The second one is, what are we looking forward to? What do you, in particular, listening to me this morning, what are you really looking forward to? It doesn't matter how silly, you don't have to answer this question, of course, but no matter how silly it is or important. And what are you not looking forward to? And sometimes the answer to the last question can be quite confusing, because it may well be something you thought you really liked doing, or places you like being. You may have changed your mind. So those are questions to think about in this conference. I suppose my situation in terms of Irish Rural Link, we have a number of important programs, 2 which I would bring to this attention. One is the significant Meals and Wheels network. This network has really found its feet, and it's the part of the network which reaches the hardest to reach groups, mainly in rural Ireland. And it's not just the delivering of the meal that is important, which it is, because many people were confined. Some people were sent home from hospital needing enormous help and resources. And of course, we didn't have the simple solution of giving them and putting them into a nursing home, because in many cases, those were not able to take new people for obvious reasons. So obviously they needed meals, at least in the first 2 weeks of being at home. But they also needed the reassurance of somebody calling to the door, somebody who could say, are you okay? Do you need anything extra? Are you feeling good? Maybe you need medical assistance, etc. So it was a wider case than just delivering the meal. And in rural areas, the really isolated areas were the areas that don't always benefit from the normal Meals and Wheels, because frankly, it's too expensive. And that's being blunt about it. If you have to bring one meal to a person or persons 25 miles up a mountain, well, you can do the sums yourselves. You know the cost. It could be 50 or 100 euro to bring that one meal. Yeah, that is the most important thing that person needs. So the second grouping, I suppose, is the grouping that we work with in terms of online. And these are people who, again, needed the services to go online to talk to their relatives. Sometimes their relatives 3 miles away, 2 miles away. And there is an excellent Citizens Online program managed by the Department of Communications. Now, ironically, because we couldn't do live classes, that funding ended for a brief period. but our volunteers in Irish Rural Link maintained it because it was the last link people had, because they were cocooning, they were having to stay behind doors and all of that. So they needed something. So we were involved in that. And in terms of, those are two examples which I am really worried about will not happen again, simply because of this. We are now racking up as a country a massive bill. We know that. What are you hearing, I ask, from government already about how we're going to deal with that? What I am hearing is that we are back to the kind of talk we had on austerity measures and the need for more austerity measures, which we suffered in the financial crash. My question, is that all we've learned? Is that the only place we can go to in recovering the program? So you can imagine, if presented with a bill for €100 to deliver a meal, which many of our members are doing voluntary, by the way, you can imagine where that will go. You can imagine where anything or service in terms of the hardest to reach or people living alone, and some great contributions by your panel so far, Stephanie and Edel in particular. I mean, Stephanie's thing about mental well-being needs to be looked at. So I know, Stephanie, you were very hopeful. I'm just asking the question, and I'm not trying to be a pessimist. Are we talking the kind of language that will maintain the goodwill and the achievements, if you want to put it in that light, of COVID-19 that we have made in the community sector? As president of the Diversity Europe, which is part of the European Economic Social Council and is an institution in itself, for the first time in its history, they have adopted and put forward to the Porto Summit on the Recovery of Europe a small little victory, which is that civil society must have a voice in the recovery and in the post-pandemic discussions. It hasn't really had that in a long time. In Ireland, we did have it a bit in the late 90s and early zeros, when social partnership, which has been decried by many, but at least it included the voices of civil society. Funny enough, Europe is now coming to the view that we cannot have a recovery without civil society. And President von der Leyen, and indeed President Macron, I was in Porto recently, and this message came across from them. So in Ireland, will we have a voice in the recovery? Will the Wheel, will Irish Rural Link, will the many organizations affiliated to this conference, will you have a say in the voice, similar to the action and experience and activity you have put into serving your members in the last year? Because really, if you haven't, then all talk about how good we are in the voluntary sector is patronization. Nothing more, nothing less. So the lessons learned by volunteers in the Wheel, and indeed the organizations here today, are many. You have learned the value of people. You have learned the value of investment in people and people services. President von der Leyen talks about a health union in Europe. What does that mean? And if Stephanie's contribution...
Seamus, can I ask you to draw to a close?
Yes, I'll finish now. I'll just finish with Stephanie's contribution in that if it means well-being, then I'm happy. So apologies for going on, Peter. I really meant to stick within the time. Thank you for
Don't you worry. No, I think it's a testament to all the speakers. You've got a lot to say, and I apologize for cutting you off, but we now have 45 minutes, where each of you will also get to participate in a conversation with our with our attendees. And you'll be pleased to hear that you have provoked lots and lots of questions, and we will do our very best to honor the questions that have been asked and to try to reflect back the sentiments that are there. Could I ask if we could get all of the panelists on screen? That will allow everybody us to feel as if we're together. At least I will take my hand down, and now that we've stopped. So I want to start maybe by coming back to Shana. So we had a lot of questions, Shana, in about the relationship with government. So this aspiration for a different kind of a more sort of, if you like, a more grown-up relationship with government, a partnership with government, where with the sense that there is now more access to money, how do we get beyond the sort of year-by-year funding into a more sustainable, grown-up, mature relationship with government? What's your advice around that?
I think it's not just Ireland. I think every civil society in the world has to face the same question. I think the pandemic showed that without resilience, if you don't have a strong infrastructure in place, you're not prepared for unexpected crises. And climate change could pose huge problems in the future here and elsewhere. What civil society does is to help make communities and specific social groups more resilient. I think there's a case to be made with the government that the knowledge of civil society, but its contribution to making people, individuals, and local communities more resilient is important to invest in, because it could cost less in the long term. So I think that there's a value for money case that is often used to privilege. I'm again going to go back to private contractors or other subcontractors, who are actually community and voluntary organizations, that they offer more value for money. And that ties into the kind of funding cycles. If you're constantly chasing money, you are not delivering services. You're constantly chasing money. And if your staff are hired for a year, you're constantly training staff and looking for new staff. So that's a lot of resources that are actually spent on things besides service delivery. So there's an argument to be made, I think, both that it's cost effective to support community and voluntary organizations because they make the population more resilient, able to manage problems at a local level and to be prepared for the next crisis. And secondly, that investing on a longer term basis helps these organizations devote themselves to the actual problem rather than managing resources.
Okay, thank you. And could I just say to the other panelists, if you want to jump in, just please raise your hand or start speaking, and I'll pull you into it. Seamus, could I ask you to respond to this as well? So, in terms of the different roles that you have, and particularly in the European role, there was a comment that was made about, Shana made actually, about the loss of confidence. Loss of confidence in government and the loss of confidence in Europe, and the dangers with that of leading towards totalitarianism, and we see this around the world. We certainly see it in history. In terms of your experience of working in Brussels or working with the European Union and working with government, how could the voluntary sector develop a more trusting relationship? How can we start to build trust in a way that gets us beyond the simply asking for money, trying to persuade for funding, getting beyond, on the premise that we can find a way of getting beyond that? What are your tactics for building that sort of trust?
Thank you. I think the tactic is all about being involved and being treated as an equal partner. And I think if you have, let's say, what we call the old-fashioned explanation of social partnership, which is employers, trade unions. That's it. That's the dialogue with government. You've left a raft of organizations and individuals and people involved in the voluntary sector out of that discussion. Yet they've played a major part in the actual activity, in particular, well, all the time, but certainly in the last year. So it is only good manners to say to the civil society in general, okay, we know you want money and we know you want resources, and we know you have a shopping list as long as your arm and longer. However, we really want to talk to you about what are your proposed solutions based on the experience you've had in the last year? And I think all of the organizations across Europe have a range of solutions to offer to the state, to Europe, which I think the state and Europe could benefit from, and which could actually, they might be surprised to learn, might even save them money. So I think we could, if we engaged in that level of trust, Peter, then I think that trust comes back, because suddenly, as well as volunteering, we're also being listened to.
Yeah. So when we talk about trust, Stephanie, it is both a personal and a professional thing. Do you think that one of the mental health challenges that we face has affected how people engage with one another in terms of trust, or how people feel about the government's capacity, for example, to protect them in a situation like this? What do you think the interpersonal challenges are associated with this?
Yeah, I suppose I feel that, of course, trust has been, one of the things that has been eroded in many ways between each other. And you can see the struggle as people come back, as restrictions lift. There's still a recoiling, as there's a new term now, the kind of shrunken self that we've learned to recoil from each other. And so how far do we take that? People have felt, I think there's been trust and distrust with government here, in terms of the narrative and what has been put out. I really would come back, if I can, to what Seamus said, which is we really do have to have our ears fully open to what is the narrative that starts now. And I think we have to push back on that. That would be my feeling. Any talk about austerity and we don't have money now for these things, I would, with my very small political hat on, I would really find that objectionable. And I think that people have been through a lot. We have learned a lot. All of those who have been stepping up to the mark, really trying to help people, finding out what is important now, what is prioritised, what needs to be prioritised. I think the government need to open their ears to that, and they need to let that be spoken out not just with platitudes, and not just in a way that they're giving them some acknowledgement. They should be listening because they want to make changes to policy, to the way we roll out services, to who we support more than others. We need to do that, and they need to listen. So they need to trust us. That's what it comes down to. You often hear it in the workplace. You will hear people saying, it's a pity management don't listen to us because we know how to do it. We know the changes that would make a difference. And that's exactly what I think Seamus is saying. And I would just echo that 100%. This is the time to listen to the people who have been trying to support and work through all the issues of this pandemic.
Thank you so much. Adele, in your presentation, there was a point at which you said, we need to demand more, we need to ask for more. The voluntary sector has been a strong voice in lobbying for change. Do you think that the mechanisms by which we are able to lobby or to advocate for change are different now because of the pandemic, and if so, in what way?
I think they should be different. I think we've just been through some kind of transformational change, so I think we need to redraw some of those spaces. And I think the Taoiseach did make reference to this whole idea of social dialogue being only one thing. I do think and there's another question here around kind of how we feed into policy and advocacy. And I do think as organizations working, with all this knowledge, we have to demand more. If we withdraw, our services, if we withdraw from society, the government is snookered 100% completely. So I think we have to kind of realize our own power a bit more, understand what we bring to the table and really amplify that more and be more demanding. And I think there's a couple of other kind of questions in there just around the funding and that type of thing. I do think we just don't demand enough. And I don't think we value ourselves enough. And I think we should always be lobbying for money. We should always be lobbying, campaigning for policy change, for legislative change. We should be feeding what's coming in through our services into through a kind of campaigning and a lens to affect change. So I do think we have to engage with change and what we want to see, where we want to be in 5 years or 10 years, or what is the community sector going to be like, and there probably is some visioning that needs to happen around that. And I just want to come in around the trust. I do think antitrust, and we have a big issue, I suppose, in terms of vaccinations and people who are not anti and who are not in favor of taking vaccines at the moment. And the whole idea of trust and this mistrust in whether that be institutions or whether it be vaccines or whether it be other areas, they create kind of wedge issues where kind of far right narratives can take hold as well. So we have to be very conscious around trust and how we also kind of even the community voluntary sector, there's people don't trust NGOs as well. So I mean, we're part of that as well. We're not exempt from being having no trust, or people don't trust us. So I do think we all have a part to play in the trust game.
Thank you. I want to come back to Shana. There's a question here which is about the practicalities of how the community sector in Ireland can become involved more internationally. It is on the premise that, if we can get access to funding and if we get more of a global focus. But what would be your advice, or what are the guidelines about how we start to, are there mechanisms by which we can become more engaged internationally? What would be the platforms on which that would happen?
I think the other panelists have mentioned a few. I think that it's trust building will be a key issue, I think, moving forward for the EU as the EU institutions and national governments. And I think that there's something to be said about cooperating with organizations in other countries, like whether it's the Wheel cooperating with a comparable organization in another country or per issue, to talk about how CSOs can contribute to building trust in institutions and in themselves. Because I think it was Adele who mentioned that, yes, CSOs are not necessarily trusted either. There was a recent survey, I think, and they came toward the bottom, or not toward the bottom, but they didn't fare well, that charities weren't necessarily well trusted in Ireland. I think that's one issue. And I think, again, this relates to a question I saw about research and policy, that the knowledge of community organizations about social problems and about the people that they work with is often much better than any other source of information. And it's pushing that knowledge. It's saying that this is very valuable moving forward, because the cost of dealing, like in Ireland, the cost of the complexity of the problems between cost of living, housing, lack of access to public health services, et cetera, unemployment among young people, those are huge issues in and of themselves, but together they're almost insurmountable for the government. So civil society is an active partner. And what we can do is pose the questions that need to be asked about the problems, lead research and policy rather than follow it, and then work with organizations in other countries who are facing the same issues. So civil society shows itself to be a powerful actor in confronting those problems, understanding those problems and confronting those problems effectively, particularly as we move forward and we're dealing with the effects of climate change, migration, et cetera.
It just in terms of research, I mean, what would be one of the things I was on the board of the Wheel, and I was involved in the same organization called NICFA in Northern Ireland. One of the challenges about our sector, I think, is often a kind of a lack of coordination, a lack of joined upness in how we present messages. And one of the ways of galvanizing that is research. So what is your advice around how the sector mobilizes and galvanizes the huge amount of intelligence and data and information that it has available to it? What would be your suggestions around how we start to mobilize that data in a way that is to our advantage in terms of giving the government evidence around priorities?
It's a good question, and I think it's hard because it would require funding, but it would be funding that would enable organizations to lead on research rather than partner necessarily with academics, where the academics are leading. It would be more of so like if there was a fund that would enable organizations to lead or to design research projects or coordinate across the EU, but those applications need to be easier to fill out. I did notice one question that they're very time-consuming research applications, so they would need to be take into account the limitations on resources within community organizations. But I also think collective action is really important. And I think the other panelists have mentioned this. It's collective production of data. It's not just a single organization. It's working together to understand both how organizations are dealing with particular issues, but also how the effectiveness of, working together and coordinating, whether it's like, between, let's say if you took an organization that works with migrants, they should be dealing with health, education, worker rights, income, housing. It's bringing all those issues together in order to understand how you effectively deal, again, with, I keep repeating myself, but problems are complex. They're not simple, and you can't relegate them to one issue. So we need to work together in conducting research. And we need to present sort of, as you've mentioned, a consensual message to the government.
Seamus, you wanted to mention something in relation to that?
Yeah, you were saying practical ways of doing research. I would argue strongly, for example, recently Eurofound, which are an excellent EU research agency based in Dublin, as it happens, they presented a good report to the EU recently and to our presidency. But the one thing that was missing, Peter, was enough knowledge as to how the charitable or voluntary sector interacts and how it contributes to the economy. And the reason they didn't touch on that is because at the end of the day, they have to be paid to do the research as well. So nobody paid them to do it. So I think if we don't value the contribution that civil society, community sector makes, it doesn't get included in the overall well-being and research, even the economic research. So I would certainly be saying to government, when you're doing the research, please include that element, because unless you pay for it, it doesn't get done.
Great. Adele, is there anything you want to add to that in terms of thinking from a migrant perspective and the value of research, or how research ends up being coordinated in order to make the argument, primarily for funding usually, but for other support as well?
I guess for me, sometimes impact drives funding as well. So being able to demonstrate impact. For me, in terms of research, I think some communities are over-researched, and we need to be really careful with that, how we over-research communities. We know the issues, sometimes it's about actually advancing them. The research that we would do would always be very pointed, and would be very much would be from an action kind of research point of view, working in collaboration with affected communities, kind of working together to come up with recommendations, but they're linked to campaigns generally. So maybe the type of research and how we do our research is slightly different, because it's always linked to a change agenda. And I think that is very important, kind of in terms of research. How does it link to change? How does it link to better outcomes for people affected? So I think we should absolutely be doing our own research, but with caution as well, with affected communities. Yeah.
Excellent. So one of the, sorry, Stephanie, you wanted to contribute?
Well, I was just going to, if for a moment, just to contribute on the mental health side, that there has been no end of research really to show the kinds of services that we need, the person-centered, the early intervention, all of that. There's no end of research. There's also no end of aspirational kind of statements from Department of Health about, when I was prepping for this morning, I recalled that the very first of them, which was planning for the future in 1985, I studied in college, there's still an awful lot of that to be implemented. And we had one here lastly in 2020, sharing the vision. I just feel we got to get past the aspirations, and maybe that's something, you know, we're faulty, you know, on as well. Break it down. What do we need? What exactly do we need to make those changes? Maybe we need to present the policy changes that we really want, and put that succinctly, because it's not always about the research. It's also about the experience that people have. I know people respond greatly to research, but we haven't time this year to research everything. And yet look how well we all did. So I think value it, but don't overvalue it.
So there are questions coming in, Stephanie, which are about volunteering.
Yes.
And I think one of the challenges we face, so if you think of one of the challenges the voluntary sector faces in relation to research, it's capturing a lot of the I want to describe it as kind of non-tangible input. So it's not necessarily people who are employed. So it's not measured by wages. It's measured by hours and goodwill and the mobilization of community life to increase the kind of social capital within a society or within a community. And I think most of us struggle. I know there are techniques for academics will use, but most of us struggle to kind of find ways of describing that or capturing it. In your work, where you're thinking about what keeps people mentally healthy and where volunteering, we understand, is a significant part of that. What in the past year, what have you seen in terms of the changes in people who perhaps have not been able to get out, not been able to volunteer in the way that they would have before? Yeah, where do you think the future of volunteering is going to be in the country?
Okay, I think that, well, volunteering is an absolute known mental health support, you know, internal kind of resilience factor. So for those who weren't able to do it, it was, and for many people who volunteer, it's a social connection. It's when they have time in their lives, they go out and give back, and they have that space in their lives to do it. Some people do it always, and I would work with a lot of the NGOs that are overseas, and I see where people have throughout all of this left their families, gone away, gone to Africa, gone to various places, and had to be there. So there's many different sort of versions of it. I think that in the future, people will see, I mean, I think it's a privilege to be able to help people. And I think it takes us all time in life maybe to realize that, and to have the space and time to do it. So I think we can certainly fly that flag very strongly for the future, that we know that it's good for you because it connects you outwards. And it doesn't have to be, this is it, we don't all have to have individual, personal love relationships. We need lots of connections that are meaningful to us. That is what makes a difference to a person's well-being in their life. Volunteering is hugely up there on that scale. And so it's ideal for the future. But what people have to remember is there is a cost to yourself. You must give a certain amount, not too much. It mustn't replace your life. You are there to do something in another person's life, but you must keep some boundaries for yourself. And sometimes we do see that where people have, in many ways, especially if they're overseas or if they work too much in the voluntary sector, they lose a certain touch with their own world and their own life. And that's an issue that we often find ourselves dealing with.
So one of the questions is about this issue about, for example, the example that is used is for board members, which in the voluntary sector are voluntary roles. And I wonder, do other panel members have views on this? Because all of you will either be in organizations where you have boards that you're dealing with, and probably also you are board members in other charities as well. And we know that there are increasing governance requirements. There are increasing demands and responsibilities that are being put on these voluntary roles. Do you, other panel members, have any advice on how to recruit people onto boards, how to recruit talent, how to hold on to that talent, and to get the best use of it in an increasingly demanding environment? Seamus, we'll start with you. Take the easy questions first.
No, I was trying to switch on my microphone. Yeah, thank you. Look, the reality is that boards require a much higher level of knowledge in terms of governance, knowledge of financial governance, knowledge of legal governance, and that's just where we are. It does mean that, on every board you have to have people of that experience and of that knowledge, and you have to seek them out. And that's just a basic. Okay, some of the smaller community boards do require assistance in terms of training, particularly governance training. I know the charitable regulator is now in place, and I suppose I'd like to see a lot more attention in making sure that that training is somehow accessed. As a previous chair of PUBL, I can say that it was always a challenge all the time to ensure that when money went to different groupings, that they did have the governance in place. And I suppose most volunteers want to do the nice things, they're there for a reason, to help people, to do whatever they can to make a person's life better, make people smile. But, coming to a meeting and saying, by the way, I think, the way we're doing the way we're handing out stuff is not properly regulated, puts you in the bad boys or bad girls corner, and suddenly you're seen as the person always harping on about systems and regulation. But Peter, I'm afraid regulation is here with us. I'm not sure we fully grasp it all the time, but practically we need to recruit people with that kind of experience, at least one or two on every board.
Thanks, Seamus. Shana, you any ideas on this?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think maybe I'm speaking from our experience, but I wouldn't be afraid of the large board. That maybe because they'll bring diverse skills, because like governance or fundraising or HR, legal expertise. That would be the main advice. Is it allows people to sometimes work less and sometimes work more.
Yeah, good. That's a very practical suggestion. Adele, any advice around this?
Yeah, I think it can be hard to attract people onto boards. I think when people realize what a board is, they're going to go, I'm not going on that. There's too much responsibility there. Sometimes a buddy and a kind of mentor kind of approach is good as well, maybe to help people to learn, some new people who are coming onto boards, because I think it can be a bit daunting in terms of, the role and responsibility. It's also a bit boring, as well, so I think there's both things. There's a huge responsibility, and it's not that, it sometimes doesn't set your world on fire, when there's it's all the regulatory stuff that you kind of have to be conscious of. So I think it's that balance, and I think that kind of buddy mentoring approach as well can be useful.
Okay. That's really good practical advice. I want to change the focus a little bit now, as we've got 15 minutes left. And I'd like us to start to address our attention specifically to the future and think about how we manage the forthcoming transition. So Stephanie, I wonder at a personal level, have you any techniques? If there was, so for example, there's a question here, which is, from a mental health perspective, if you could ask one thing of government and you knew that they were going to say yes to it, and it can't be just give us a whole load of money, it has to be quite specific. If there's one thing you were to ask of government to support the mental health of the population as we manage these transitions, what would that be? And do you have any practical advice about how people manage their mental health and well-being, how they look after themselves over the changes that we know are going to be happening over the coming months and years?
Okay, the very first, certainly if I had one ask, and it would be, as they say, granted, I really think that GPs are the first point of call. They do tend to get to absorb the what is happening and get a first view of problems. They then, of course, assess, diagnose, and either prescribe or give, send someone, towards a waiting list or towards somebody in the service, but often had to wait for them for quite a while. And for a long time, I've been advocating for a kind of almost like an in-house, service within our primary care system, where there can be someone there on tap, or who can just give that first, what we would call that first line of information and containment of the problem. Because sometimes people go to their GP with a huge issue and they go straight back home with it without any extra information. And this is not against GPs, because they have an awful lot to do, and we've seen what they've done in this enormous time. So it's not a criticism, it's a systemic thing. And so that would be what I would be looking for. Counsellor, therapist, social prescriber, have them on a first line of defence with GPs. So GPs can call on that straight away. That would contain, we're very aware of how that can contain problems and stop them from escalating. So it sort of gives a small tick on the early intervention line. The second part was, as people come out of restrictions, very interesting, isn't it, for all of us to watch and understand the reticence that we feel. Like, quite interestingly, I was vaccinated in March. I really didn't feel, I still felt all of the same restriction and all of the same sense of trepidation, if you like, about, the transfer of COVID, etc., until many, many more people around me were vaccinated and felt safe 4 weeks, say, afterwards. So I think you have to realize it is going to take time. And what I encourage people to do is, don't rush back, do it slowly. Don't take on just because you can doesn't mean you should. And the other thing I ask people to do is to make explicit what you've learned about yourself. Make explicit by writing it down. Make it explicit, because if you don't make what is unconscious conscious, you can do nothing about it. So what have you learned? As Seamus mentioned earlier, what habits have changed? Which of them do you want to keep? What have you learned? Because if you don't write this down, and if you don't say it out to yourself, it's going to go straight down the unconscious plug hole as soon as this is all over and everybody is having pints in the pubs. So I would say to you, make that explicit. That is the gift you can really give yourself.
Okay. Thanks so much. Shana, there's a very specific question here, which is about women in their 50s, the increases in depression and issues around menopause. Is there anything you want to say? Is there a link between this and suicide rates for girls and women, between the issues of mental health in that particular group and what has been happening over the last year in Ireland and in the UK?
I wouldn't be necessarily an expert, but it's loneliness. It wasn't depression; it was loneliness with the Eurofound data, and that I'm assuming goes to the fact that women are living alone. I think for that population, not just women. Anecdotally, I've known people who have been living alone over the past year and a half, and it's been very difficult because they don't have that kind of social interaction. If you're working at home with all the benefits of remote working, you don't have an office environment or contact with other people. So I think that a missing issue from the joys of remote working is what the home life is like, where you're actually based. I'm hoping because we're doing some work both on social prescribing and domestic violence. I'm hoping that going forward, because mental health issues have come to the fore and domestic violence issues have come to the fore during the pandemic, that the government will be a lot more conscious of the support systems that need to be put in place to make people less unconfident or less anxious about talking to their doctor or their GP or another health professional to say, one, I'm in an abusive relationship, or two, I'm actually feeling quite depressed. What do you think I could do about it? I think that would be, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think that the lesson we need to draw from that is that, like, social prescribing, which is when the health professional connects to a community organization and says, I think this will help you out. Or people will say, I need help I need intervention because I'm in a risky situation. That those would be a lot less stigmatized, that people feel a lot more confident, whatever their age is and whatever their sex, in asking for help.
Yeah, and the community and voluntary sector can have a critical role in that, in terms of social providing, by providing a whole variety of options for GPs to be able to prescribe into. So there is a really important partnership role. We're coming towards the end, so we've got about 6 or 7 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to go around each panel member and ask, so this is a slightly self-interested question. It is on the basis of all that we've been talking about today. You know, the Wheel is the representative organisation for the community sector in Ireland. One of the challenges the Wheel faces is how it represents this very diverse, very wide range of interests that there are within the sector. We've covered many of them today: issues around research, lobbying for funding, all of the different challenges that the organisation faces. When you, as panelists and as experts in your own field, think about the challenges that are faced by the community and voluntary sector in Ireland, and think about the coming months and years of, you know, hybrid models, different challenges, actually the possibility of funding being available, what do you think the priority should be for our sector in terms of its engagement with government, as the first question? And secondly, what can the Wheel do to help facilitate that? So is there anything specifically that we need to be thinking about in terms of our priorities and our strategic plans, and how we help the voluntary sector develop in the way that it has an ambition to do so? So I'm going to start maybe with Adele, if you don't mind, just in response to that, and then we'll go around each panelist before we finish.
A big question.
There's no time.
Yeah.
No time limit on this, Adele.
I mean, I think the priorities are coming up through the questions, to be honest, you know, and a lot of it is about funding, recognition, you know, engagement with the state, and I think and critical engagement. I think it's not just engagement, you know, and I do think there's obviously different approaches as well to how it's a very diverse sector between community, voluntary, you know, so we all have different approaches in how we deliver our work. So maybe also amplifying those types of different approaches and what they can deliver. Yeah, I don't know, it's that there are things off the top of my head. I just wanted to make, just before we finish, because you probably won't come back to me, just a couple of people have mentioned the SDGs in the chat a few times, and I do think we, you know, coming out of this period, we do have to always have a global approach to our work and how we, you know, support you know, even the rollout of vaccines in other countries. So Ireland, you know, needs to be very much to the forefront of that as well. And there was one question around recession narratives. I guess there's something about, you know, the seeping in, and this is something I do believe that the Wheel can work on as well. It's like when people start to talk about a recession, you almost create a recession. Because you stifle consumer spending, and consumer spending then drives down taxes. So you have this kind of cycle of recession that kind of natural, that sort of almost is self prophesizing. And so I do think, you know, fighting that whole narrative around, well, we have to pay for what we spent this year. But we, you know, we can pay. There's lots of different ways to pay for that. I think getting better at the economy and stuff. I think Seamus kind of made reference to that. You know, what's our contribution? How does so I think being much better around the economics of our sector and the understanding, you know, and having pushback around that recession narrative, around you know, that there isn't enough to go around. There is, and we just have to find it from somewhere. There's political choices. All of this is a political choice. No more than investment in mental health services or other services. It's all a political choice. And business have a very big lobby. Business don't want to pay more, and employers don't want to pay more. And that's something we need to think about as well, because actually that's where some of our money will come from. So I think there's a tension there as well. So I think, yeah, we kind of need to get a bit better at that.
Great, Adele, thank you. Seamus, I'll come on to you. Priorities for the sector and the role of the Wheel.
Okay, I'll definitely try and address this. First of all, just to say that we have to acknowledge government, particularly the Department of Rural Affairs and Community Affairs, have been quite active, and I'd like some of that to stay. In other words, by setting up the COVID Sustainability Fund for the sector, that has made a difference. And from my perspective, obviously, the launch of Rural Futures, which is about, when I asked the question about habits, it's about trying to keep people in the rural areas. And one of the things, if you walk around a rural area today, you'll find people there, which is strange, in the middle of the day, because there are research which shows that there is a massive migration, before COVID, by the way, massive migration of people from rural areas into the cities or wherever, and back then at night. So you had effectively people living in rural areas at nighttime, but not there in the day. And the one thing people in well-being terms want is to know that there are people around the place. So I would certainly like to see that learning continue. In terms of the wheel, I'd have to compliment the wheel, in particular Deirdre, and in fact, motivating government, as it were, and helping to contribute to the Sustainability Fund. But I think we have to get active in saying, yes, it is about economics. And if we're going to measure GDP only, if we're going to use GDP only as our measurement as to how we're doing as a country, then I'm sorry. But if you go back to 19, the GDP was quite good. We were doing very well. No problems on the horizon. And guess what? So I think we could do with saying to the wheel, get into the economic discussions and make sure that austerity is not the main narrative. Learning from the crisis, in other words, we do have to find different financial tools and mechanisms. It doesn't mean going mad borrowing, but it does mean looking at different ways of funding issues. And remember, in fairness, as I said to rural and Gaeltacht, rural community, they did come up with the goods in terms of sustainability, in terms of COVID, and I think we should try and continue that.
Thank you so much, Seamus. Shana, maybe on to you.
Thank you. I would echo what's been said. I think it's particularly important as a priority, just my own 2 cents, is that both measuring impact in different ways than what the funding prescribes, and in the sense that this is what the sector offers, and doing it more across organizations and across organizations that work in the same area, and also providing alternative visions of the future. I think tying to the austerity argument, the government and the program for government, they did push for measuring well-being. So I think that's a space that the wheel could get into to talk about their role specifically, but also the sector. And then saying this is the data that you need in order to understand well-being. And if that's the direction you want to go in, then austerity should be off the table, because you really have to invest in order to promote well-being. And I think it's those kinds of political arguments rooted in a multifaceted, more complex understanding of the impact of the sector. So it's not just we helped out 1,000 people last month. It's more like we helped people understand, we help people get into education at the same time they see their doctor more regularly, et cetera. So this is our impact, which does translate into economic value. And I think that the sector, because it's so under-resourced, often doesn't understand, or it's not able to document its value in a way that's effective for lobbying or having lobbying skills. I think a lot of times we don't even have those skills. Whereas like if you look at business, they have multiple organizations that are lobbying for them in addition to in-house lobbyists. So I think the wheel could become an effective lobbyist for the sector, but also push some of the government's own arguments about where it wants to go, even pre-pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. That's extremely helpful. Thank you so much. And Stephanie, final word to you then about the priorities for the future and the wheel.
I suppose the priorities that I would like to see, I think, and I'm beating the drum of mental health because that's my expertise, but I would think that we have a health service that is very focused on emergencies. I would really like to see that change. I know I've mentioned the idea for supporting GPs, but I think GPs really, and at that primary level, need some psychosocial kind of support and some input. If we could have that, we have a new layer of help going on in society, which I think we badly need. We then can get away from this kind of emergency service response, which is, you're meeting people at the end of their issues. And in a way, I would say that we could put some pressure on our private health insurers to play a big part in this. They've had quite an easy year. They've hopefully had a little extra money in their pockets, and let's hope that maybe they could open up some more say just a limited number of sessions or support to people who maybe normally wouldn't be entitled to those within their various plans. I think that would be a very good gesture. So I would put that out there. I'm a bit of a solutions sort of focused person, so they're my 3 thoughts for the future, what I'd love to see and what I'll work at.
Listen, that's fantastic. I have really enjoyed this. You've made my job extremely easy. Shana, Stephanie, Adele, and Seamus have you've given us loads of food for thought. I'm frustrated because there are loads of questions that we haven't been able to get on. So you provoked the audience to lots and lots of different issues, and you've made it feel really relevant and useful, giving us lots of food for thought. So I'm extremely grateful. Again, you made my job easy. You kept the time, which is the main thing as well. So I really appreciate that. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Ivan Cooper from the Wheel, who I think is going to wrap things up for us. So Ivan, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. And just a huge thank you to Peter and Stephanie and Shana and Adele and Seamus for such a remarkable discussion, really, on our communal experience as a society and an economy of the COVID crisis, and the impacts, and we've heard a lot of reference to that word, positive and negative, and what they've been and what we've learned, and in particular, you know, in the context of our shared desire for an inclusive, sustainable and just Ireland of thriving community life. Before I reflect briefly on what we have heard, and how we can work together to take these reflections forward in shaping our vision for a post-COVID Ireland, I think it's important just to remind ourselves of what we did hear from An Taoiseach Micheál Martin this morning. An Taoiseach talked about the crucial role played during the crisis by the community and voluntary sector, about the need for a partnership model between the sector and government, about the close working relationship that held between government and the sector during the crisis, and in the process of co-developing the suite of ambitious strategies for the sector for social enterprise and for volunteering, developed by the Department of Rural and Community Development. An Taoiseach also noted his government's commitment to supporting and empowering the community and voluntary sector. And these are most welcome observations and commitments and provide a very real opportunity for transforming the relationship that holds between the sector and government in the years ahead, also reflected by the Programme for Government Commitment to Social Dialogue. So there are opportunities, and having heard this morning's discussion, you know, it's clear that we need to assert into those opportunities and make those more than pious words, okay? So that's our challenge. So we very much look forward to engaging with An Taoiseach and members of the government in the short-term future to discuss social dialogue and making that real social dialogue and critical social dialogue, as Adele referenced, and how it can be strengthened so that the community and voluntary sector can play our full part in assisting government to rebuild for the future and ensure a fair recovery for Ireland socially and economically. The richness of the conversation we have just witnessed, and I think in a very real way virtually participated in, I certainly felt that I did, is itself, I think, exemplary of why our community and voluntary sector will play a crucial role in reshaping our society and economy in the post-COVID years ahead. We've heard reference this morning to all manner of changes and challenges and opportunities that will be coming, and reference to the way in which, in many cases, the appropriate community values-based responses to challenges and opportunities are already here in the room. The community-inspired vision and the generosity of energy and solidarity is here in the membership of the Wheel, in the wider community and voluntary sector, and in the room today and on the platform. Our challenge is to harness that generous energy and community vision and connect it into shaping the future at the highest level, and to insist on a reshaping of national policymaking itself, so that through social dialogue and partnership approaches, the way ahead reflects and is shaped by the experience, the learning, the wisdom, the vision, and the real priorities of all present today. So We heard about the way people and communities have experienced and responded to the COVID challenge, about the impact on people's well-being, and about some of the ways we can, to use an increasingly relevant expression, build forward better as our sector continues to play its crucial role sustaining thriving community life in the period ahead. I heard some things this morning. I just want to reflect them back to you. And it was such a superbly high quality set of inputs and facilitation by Peter. I heard Shana talk about the need for the ongoing discussion with the state and about expanding the role of the community and voluntary sector beyond marginalised groups. And I heard Shana talk about helping CSOs to understand their full societal impact and to escape the financial kind of impact framework and get beyond that to tell the full story of the social value contributed by Ireland's community and voluntary sector. I heard Adele specifically talk about migrants being more exposed and overrepresented in care, in home care, in agri-food and in the gig economy, and lacking access to social protection, and reminding us of the fact that, again, as Stephanie put it, we have not all been in the same boat together. But I also heard Adele talk about the gains, that it not being business as usual, and the COVID crisis showing us what's achievable. And when we put concerns about budgets to one side, the money is there. It is always about determining and prioritizing what's important. The state could and did respond properly and effectively, as did the CV sector, as referenced by Adele. And I heard Adele talking about the need for us to work for transformative change, the need to be careful about the framing and the reframing and the return of the competition for resources frame. We know the money's there if it's needed, and we need to keep our eye on that. We need to combat recession narratives. Again, that came through from Seamus's contributions too. And we need to, the work and the health and the consumption and the environment and how the links between all these different facets of our lives have become clear. We've got this great holistic reference frame that we can work within now. If we can hold on to that, put that center stage, and again, from Adele's contribution, hold power to account and the importance of doing that. Stephanie, I felt, just grounded us fabulously again in the experience of ourselves as individuals and members of families and communities. And I think really interestingly talked about self-care and it not just being an indulgence, it's a responsibility. We have a responsibility to ourselves for self-care and of course to others to ensure that we all take care of ourselves. There were positives, lots of progress Adele referenced in increased awareness of the importance of mental health. This is absolutely true. I think many people much more confident in speaking about their own mental health and respecting the importance to enable people to focus in on that aspect of themselves without being judged and without being somehow felt wanting if they do that. Stephanie made reference to the need for, of course, greatly increased investment in mental health care services and in work, and how privileged it was for those of us who have work and were able to continue working during this crisis, and in particular, those of us who work from home. And again, this point about us all definitely not being in the same boat, and how in many respects it was only in the absence of the workplace that it became clear to many of us how much value we actually see in that. And the challenge for managers of proactively rather than reactively supporting staff and employees in this period of hybrid work that's undoubtedly coming. And volunteering was an important theme that came through. And again, in the discussion in relation to the importance of the connectedness that volunteering constitutes for many people. Seamus, in particular, I thought centered us, about this ever-present worry about this return of the austerity narrative. We've heard the language that officially that's not the direction we want to move in, but we know the pressures that are going to be there in relation to where the tax revenues are going to come from. And Seamus specifically languaged it, worried about the threat to public budgets that are posed by the huge debt. Is austerity the only thing we have learned? Are we talking the kind of language to maintain the gains of COVID-19 in services? Civil society must have a voice in the post-COVID reconstruction, turning back to that voice challenge. Will we have a voice in the recovery? Similar to the effort that we put into services during the pandemic, because we worked our socks off. We want to be able to have the same work our socks off contribution in relation to reshaping the policy future. So I just wanted to do justice and pay respect to the amazing contributions this morning by perhaps not wanting to summarize, but just to restore to prominence the early contributions that preceded the rich discussion that then followed. And we had an exploration of themes like trust and other vitally important themes too. So I just want to commit to following through on all of these themes in relation to building forward from here in relation to the public policy agenda. And these points, I think, provide a fantastic jumping off point for tomorrow morning's plenary session, which will focus more on the sector itself, looking at what we have learned from the experience about what's possible when differences are put aside and the sector, government and funders work together on common and pressing priorities. So tomorrow, we'll be further unwrapping these themes in the context of the sector, and we'll be looking at the nature of the funding and compliance relationship. We'll be looking at the possibilities for deeper partnership working, the challenges we face addressing poverty, marginalization and social exclusion in the post-COVID world, and what the sector can do to raise awareness of this crucial impact of the work that it does in Ireland today. So don't forget also, that's the kind of the end of my reflective piece. I'd just like to now turn very briefly to this afternoon's sessions, which both start at 2 p.m. And include two sessions. Everybody is spoiled for choice. We have the first session, well, not the first, one of the two being, it's looking at preparing the nonprofit workforce for the challenges ahead. And in this session, we'll explore what it will mean to prepare nonprofit workers for the challenges ahead. And we'll be exploring the evidence base for skills development in the sector and looking at emerging skill needs of the future and how they will be catered for in and by the sector. So that's a very exciting session coming up with Suzanne Connolly, CEO of Barnardo's, Sheena Cahill from Sheena Cahill Consulting, Dr. Nat O'Connor, Senior Public Affairs and Policy Specialist with Age Action Ireland, and our own Mairead O'Connor, Skills Development Senior Manager in the Wheel, in the chair. Also this afternoon, we have a special conversation with Ireland's EU funding contact points, not to be missed by those looking for funding opportunities in the European context. 2021 marks the beginning of a new 7-year multi-annual financial framework, and this means a whole new generation of European funding programs and a fresh batch of opportunities coming for civil society organizations. And the panel will bring together many national contact points for EU funding to discuss the opportunities in civil society for their respective programs. So it's your opportunity to learn about the opportunities for your organization, what supports are available, and how to design impactful applications that will deliver on your strategic goals. Speakers include Shona Murray, from European correspondent with Euronews, Lorraine Gilligan, Executive Director of Lergus, Brendan Mooney, the Programs Executive at Northern and Western Regional Assemblies, Garrett Murray, National Director for Horizon Europe at Enterprise Ireland, and Luke Devoy, Assistant Principal at the European Social Fund in the Department of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science. So with all that said, thank you once again to our fabulous plenary panel participants, Peter, Adele, Stephanie, Shana and Seamus this morning. You've set a really, really high bar for us going on and provided us with such food for thought to take forward in a structured way as we go on from here. And we are really looking forward to welcoming everyone again to our conference this afternoon and at our plenary tomorrow morning. So with all of that said, folks, I'd like to say a goodbye and thank you again, Peter, in particular, for such a fabulous facilitation job. So if we could all hear each other, there's a round of applause from me, okay? So thanks very much, everybody, and looking forward to taking it on from here. Enjoy your lunch, and bye-bye for the time being.
Well, now,